The security gate rattled as I slammed my palm against the control box, desperate to pry it open. A muffled siren blared in the distance, each wail hitting my chest like a sledgehammer. The paramedics would be here any minute, but I already knew they wouldn't make it in time. Not with this monstrous iron barricade blocking the only entrance. A frantic voice shouted behind me, "Hurry, they need help." We were all stuck on the inside, about to lose precious moments we couldn't afford. I never thought it would come to this when I moved into Willow Bend Estates. I'd always heard bits and pieces about homeowners associations, wild stories of overzealous members collecting fines for leaving a trash can at the curb 5 minutes too long. But I always brushed those off as exaggerated rumors. My introduction to the Willow Bend HOA was more subdued at first. Standard welcome notices, glossy newsletters full of landscaping tips, and a kindly older gentleman on the board, Mr. Fellows, dropping off fresh-baked cookies. They seemed harmless enough, until the new HOA president, Brian Carver, decided our sleepy enclave needed a top-tier security upgrade. Brian was a man of grand gestures. He'd show up to monthly community meetings with perfectly color-coded charts and presentations that rivaled any corporate pitch, passionately arguing for better roads, improved lighting, and a prestigious brand image for Willow Bend. His biggest achievement, however, was convincing 60% of the HOA to install an unbreachable security gate at our main entrance, comparable to those you'd see at some high-profile celebrity mansion. I remember him flashing that trademark grin as we stood around a table with pamphlets on wrought iron gates. "We'll be the safest and most exclusive neighborhood in the county," he declared. "No trespassers, no late-night door-to-door salesmen. None of those petty nuisances." He talked about liability, break-ins, property values, and how a gate would ensure Willow Bend stood out above all other local subdivisions. To sweeten the deal, he claimed installing the gate would help reduce our insurance premiums. In reality, the gate turned out to be a fortress with temperamental software that refused to open if you entered the wrong code more than once. It also lacked a straightforward manual override for emergency vehicles. "Oh, we'll handle that with a digital solution," Brian assured us when I voiced concerns. The digital solution turned out to be an app that half the residents couldn't figure out. If the power flickered, it reset. If you typed in your code too slowly, it locked you out for 3 minutes. Worst of all, the gate's control mechanism wasn't regularly updated for first responder codes. I'd grown wary, but most residents just grumbled in private. After all, Brian Carver was unstoppable with a gavel and a majority vote. Then the crisis came. A neighbor, Mrs. Vogel, had collapsed during her morning stroll around the cul-de-sac. She was 72, a retired teacher who devoted her days to crocheting blankets for the local animal shelter. She didn't deserve to be in distress, lying on the hot asphalt waiting for a rescue that might not get there in time. I was there, kneeling at her side, trying to keep her alert while others called 911. The nearest hospital was less than 10 minutes away, but that wouldn't matter if the ambulance got stuck outside that steel monstrosity. Despite repeated attempts to punch an emergency override, the gate wouldn't budge. 2 more residents joined me, both of them fiddling with their phones, frantically trying to open that lock via the glitchy neighborhood app. Nothing. Whether it was an app malfunction or the gate software had frozen, we didn't know. What we did know was that an ambulance's lights were already on the horizon, winding its way up the main road. I clenched my jaw. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was my aunt calling from her office at the local fire department, the place she'd served as fire chief for the last 5 years. I was far too panicked to think about her in that moment. Instead, I barked at the 2 men wrestling with the control box. "We might have to force it," I said. Both gave me a wide-eyed stare. As my mind spun with the worst-case scenarios, I kicked the lower part of the gate, hoping the rattling might jolt something loose. Behind us, Mrs. Vogel's granddaughter arrived, tears streaming down her face. She clutched her phone, pressing it to her ear, likely trying to relay instructions from the emergency operator. The tension in the air was suffocating, and the summer heat amplified everything. Then it happened. The squeal of tires as the ambulance slowed to a halt at the gate, red and blue lights pulsing off that unyielding iron. Medics jumped out with a stretcher, but they were separated from Mrs. Vogel by an impenetrable barrier. The sense of helplessness was crushing. My heart pounded as precious seconds ticked away. It took a frantic neighbor climbing onto a ladder on the side of the fence, yelling across to the medics, to coordinate a makeshift rescue. As if we were in some kind of medieval siege, they managed to hoist their gear over the fence, then come around through an open side yard. By the time they reached Mrs. Vogel, she was barely conscious. It was an agonizing wait before they finally whisked her away, sirens piercing the humid afternoon air. What should have taken minutes felt like an eternity. And as I stared at that silent, unresponsive gate, I knew something had to give. Because today we got lucky enough to hustle the paramedics in through backyards. Tomorrow, we might not be so lucky. In that moment, I vowed to do something about it, even if it meant taking on the entire HOA board. Little did I know, I had an ally far more powerful than I realized. My aunt, the county fire chief. And Brian Carver, with all his grand plans and inflated ego, had absolutely no clue who he was about to go up against. Later that evening, as a heavy hush settled over Willow Bend, my phone vibrated. It was my aunt calling again. The mix of relief and dread in my stomach was almost nauseating. I hadn't called her yet to tell her about the day's fiasco. When I answered, her familiar voice resonated through the speaker, calm yet probing. "Hey kiddo, I got a report about an ambulance being blocked by a gate. That's your neighborhood, isn't it?" I let out a soft groan. Yeah, the gate locked up, and it was a nightmare. I paced around my living room, my mind still buzzing from adrenaline and leftover rage. We nearly lost a neighbor, Aunt Gwen. The paramedics had to scale a fence, for crying out loud. There was a slight pause. "Is this the new high-tech gate your HOA installed?" I sighed. One and the same. Aunt Gwen was quiet for a moment, and I could almost see her squinting in thought. That's a pretty serious violation. Fire codes require swift entry for all emergency services. I've got the official documents in front of me. We have a list of neighborhoods that use a universal passcode, a lockbox with a key, or a system integrated with our dispatch. Willow Bend used to have a standard lockbox. Did they remove that? They sure did, I replied. The HOA board insisted the new system would handle everything digitally. Only it didn't. She sighed. All right, I'll need your help. I can't just waltz in there as fire chief without verifying a few details. You're a resident, so your cooperation might simplify the investigation. If they're in violation, they could face a hefty fine. I thought back to Brian Carver's unwavering confidence and the arrogance that made him so certain he'd built an impenetrable fortress. If he'd neglected city and county requirements, it wasn't just a matter of a small penalty. I recalled Aunt Gwen mentioning once that fines could run into the thousands, possibly even hundreds of thousands if multiple infractions stacked up. Little did I know I was about to become an undercover agent in my own neighborhood. Over the next week, Aunt Gwen sent me direct references to specific fire codes, instructions on how to document pictures of the gate's mechanics, and what kind of signage was required. She reminded me to stay discreet. She didn't want the HOA altering anything before her office could inspect it officially. But Willow Bend was a small pond. Word traveled fast. Even though Mrs. Vogel was recovering quietly at home with her granddaughter, many residents were outraged. A handful demanded an emergency HOA meeting. Others wrote letters, urging Brian Carver to disable the gate until further notice. His response was a mass email that read like a politician's press release. He insisted the paramedics could have opened the gate if they had used the correct procedure, and that the system was perfectly compliant with local regulations. None of it rang true. As tension simmered, I dropped by the HOA clubhouse after hours to photograph a sign posted near the control box. It was the instructions for visitors, another thick packet of steps, codes, and disclaimers. The language was so dense it looked like a legal contract. The more I read, the angrier I got. Basic instructions for emergency access weren't even listed, nor was there any mention of a manual override. It seemed like an accident waiting to happen, except that accident had already nearly cost us a neighbor's life. The next morning, I sent everything I'd collected to Aunt Gwen. Pictures of the signage, screenshots of neighborhood emails, the gate's brand and model number. She told me to sit tight. It was only a matter of time before the county would show up for a formal inspection. Meanwhile, rumors started circulating that the fire department was investigating the gate. Brian Carver, in his typical self-assured way, had begun telling people that there was no cause for concern and that the board is handling it. In reality, behind the scenes, the tension was all too real. I saw it in the worried expressions of neighbors, in hush-hush conversations near mailboxes. Some longtime residents who once adored Carver's enthusiasm were now giving him the cold shoulder. Meanwhile, the board had a routine meeting scheduled at the end of the month, an event that was shaping up to be a showdown between Carver supporters and everyone furious about the gate debacle. During that time, Anquin didn't say much. "I'll keep you posted," she repeated. "Just keep your eyes open. Don't stir the pot too much. We'll want to catch them red-handed so they can't weasel out." Patience had never been my strong suit, but this time I resolved to wait. I watched from my living room window as different repairmen showed up, fiddling with the gate's electronics, presumably searching for software glitches. But I doubted they could fix their compliance failures with a few lines of code. If they want to keep the gate, they'd need a manual override or a lockbox that emergency services could access on demand. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when I caught a glimpse of Brian Carver walking around with a city inspector. I recognized her from the local building authority website, a cautious, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Alvarez. She was pointing at different parts of the gate, scribbling notes in a clipboard. Carver's face was taut, his usually confident posture stiffened. After they left, neighbors whispered that Ms. Alvarez appeared unimpressed, shaking her head repeatedly. Some residents overheard snippets of conversation, something about not following proper guidelines, the system not matching code standards and needing immediate changes. By the time evening rolled around, an official notice from the building authority was taped to our community bulletin board. It stated that Willow Bend was being placed under a compliance review. The gate might be forcibly disabled until it met local emergency access regulations. You'd think that at this point Brian Carver and the board would concede. Maybe they'd own up to mistakes, promise to fix everything. But pride is a strange thing. Instead, they doubled down. A few hours later, the board blasted out a second mass email, basically telling residents not to worry and that adequate measures were being taken. So there we were, caught between the official black-and-white rules set by Aunt Gwen's fire department and the building authority and the half-truths spouted by our HOA's leadership. Every day felt like a standoff. And all the while, Aunt Gwen was quietly preparing to pull out a trump card I didn't even know she held. A couple of weeks slid by in a strange haze. On the surface, Willow Bend's manicured lawns and tidy sidewalks looked as charming as ever. But there was an undercurrent of frustration that wasn't going away. The gate still loomed at the entrance, each wrought iron spike a reminder of the havoc it had caused. Mrs. Vogel was slowly returning to her routine, though her granddaughter was now accompanying her on daily walks, just in case. Meanwhile, Brian Carver made frequent appearances, greeting neighbors with his broad smile and hearty handshake, assuring anyone who'd listen that everything was under control. I rarely saw him without a stack of glossy brochures in his arms, handouts that claimed our security system was state-of-the-art and vetted by experts, although I hadn't met a single real expert who endorsed it. One day after work, I noticed a tense figure standing in front of the gate. It was Mr. Fellows, the older gentleman who'd first welcomed me with cookies. He looked disheartened, his shoulders slumped as he studied a stack of documents in his hand. When I joined him, he offered a weak smile. "Hey," I said softly. "Everything all right?" He shook his head. "Not really, son. I've been on this HOA board for over a decade. Never seen it this chaotic. Carver convinced us all that this gate was going to be a boon for the neighborhood, but it's turned into a disaster. And now he's ignoring half our concerns. We're as much in the dark as any other resident." He waved the papers in his hand. "We got an email saying we need a plan to meet the building authority's guidelines in 2 weeks or face penalties. But Carver says we can file an extension. Is that even possible?" I asked. "In some cases," Mr. Fellows admitted, "but we're not showing any good faith effort to fix the root of the problem. We don't have a workable override for emergency vehicles. And as you know, that nearly cost us Mrs. Vogel's life." I pressed my lips together. Part of me wanted to reassure him that my aunt was stepping in, but I still wasn't sure how big of a role she'd play. Maybe it's time for the board to push back against Carver more openly, I suggested. He can't be the only voice. He gave me a sad smile. It's complicated. The man's got friends in high places, or so he says. And folks here, they don't like conflict. They just want to live in peace. Before I could respond, we heard the distant roar of a diesel engine. A big, red ladder truck turned the corner, rolling slowly up to the gate. I recognized it instantly. Engine 41 from Aunt Gwen's department. My heart leapt into my throat. The truck stopped just outside, lights off, but clearly on official business. A uniformed official stepped out. It wasn't Aunt Gwen. It was one of her lieutenants. He called out, "We're here to conduct a routine check for emergency access compliance." His voice boomed, a no-nonsense ring echoing across the quiet street. Brian Carver, who seemed to materialize out of thin air, rushed forward, posture rigid with forced politeness. "This isn't a good time," Carver tried, forcing a measured smile. "I wasn't informed of any inspection." The lieutenant's face remained neutral. "We don't need to schedule a time for a compliance check, sir. State fire regulations allow unannounced visits." Carver hesitated, then stepped aside, fiddling with his phone to open the gate via the app. It groaned open, revealing the truck. The crew drove in, parked, and began inspecting the area, conferring with each other in hushed tones. I noticed they tested the gate's emergency codes, tried the keypad multiple times, and asked Carver-pointed questions about backup systems and manual overrides. He gave half-hearted answers, sounding less confident with each query. Word must have spread, because within minutes, a small crowd of neighbors gathered, watching the spectacle. I spotted Ms. Alvarez from the building authority, too. She nodded politely at the lieutenant and pointed to several features on the gate, scribbling more notes. Meanwhile, Carver's face was set like stone. Then, out of nowhere, Aunt Gwen arrived in her own official fire department SUV. She stepped out in her uniform, scanning the group with cool professionalism. Catching my eye, she offered a subtle nod. My stomach twisted, half anxious, half relieved. Brian Carver approached her with an outstretched hand, trying to feign cordiality. "Chief, I'm Brian Carver, HOA president." She shook his hand briefly, her expression unreadable. "I'm aware," she replied. "I've been reviewing the reports." I don't think Carver realized I was related to the fire chief. He didn't even glance in my direction. The inspection continued for another hour. They measured distances, tested locks, took pictures. Carver tried to keep up, but the rest of the board members, including Mr. Fellows, lingered behind him looking uneasy. The tension was palpable. You could practically feel the friction crackle in the air. Finally, the lieutenant turned to Aunt Gwen and gave her a short report. She nodded gravely, then stepped forward to address the board members. "I'm afraid you're out of compliance in multiple ways. You don't have a functioning override that can be accessed by emergency personnel. Your digital system is prone to locking out repeated attempts, which is unacceptable. We've recorded at least 4 direct code violations, each carrying a sizable fine." Carver's face blanched. "4? That can't be. We installed the best gate on the market. Our software is top tier." She silenced him with a stern look. "It doesn't matter how expensive or high-tech it is. It has to comply with local fire and emergency codes. If it doesn't, it's a hazard. Plain and simple." Ms. Alvarez chimed in. "You also disregarded the standard building authority guidelines for gating communities. No lockbox, no master key, no universal passcode. None of the provisions we require are in place." Carver's brow glistened under the midday sun. He wiped away sweat with a handkerchief. "We can fix these issues. We just need some time." Aunt Gwen exchanged a glance with Ms. Alvarez, then looked at Brian Carver directly. "You've had weeks since the incident with the ambulance. My office has to file an official notice with the county indicating these violations. Based on the severity, the fines can add up to," she paused briefly, $500,000 if not remedied promptly. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Mr. Fellows' eyes went wide. The color drained completely from Carver's face. It took him a moment to regain composure, but when he did, He attempted a dismissive laugh. That's ludicrous. You can't be serious. Antwin kept her gaze level. We're very serious, Mr. Carver. If you fail to comply within the timelines set by the county, your HOA will be fined. And depending on further investigations, you could face additional penalties beyond that. I half expected Carver to erupt in protests. Instead, he just stood there, mouth opening and closing, unable to form words. A hush lingered, heavy as a storm cloud about to burst. The next day felt like living in a new neighborhood, like the gate's looming shadow had suddenly become the talk of the entire county. Local news vans lined the main road, eager to capture footage of the infamous gate that delayed an ambulance. Reporters tried to snag interviews with anyone who walked by. I was on my front lawn when Mr. Fellows shuffled up, face still etched with worry. We've called an emergency HOA meeting for tonight, he said quietly. Without Carver, if necessary. We need to address this before it escalates further. That evening, we gathered in the clubhouse, a modest brick building typically used for potlucks and holiday parties. Now it was standing room only, neighbors crammed onto folding chairs. At the front, Mr. Fellows nervously cleared his throat, while a few other board members shuffled papers. Brian Carver was conspicuously absent, until suddenly he barged in through the back door, cheeks flushed, sweat beating at his temple. In a flustered voice, he insisted on addressing the assembly immediately. These allegations are exaggerated, he began, voice tight. The fire department is overreaching. $500,000? That's highway robbery. The gate is a benefit, not a threat. A few neighbors shook their heads in disbelief. Others glowered. One older woman stood up. My husband's on oxygen. If an ambulance can't get in, that's a matter of life and death, Mr. Carver. Her voice trembled with anger. How dare you call it an exaggeration? Another man rose from his seat. We supported you, Carver. We believed in your plans. But you shut down every objection about emergency access. You assured us it was handled. Now you expect us to pay for your mistake. Carver's eyes darted around the room. Look, I understand. And we can fix this. We just need to update the software, maybe add a direct link to the fire department. Which you should have done from the start, someone else shouted. Mr. Fellows raised a hand, trying to restore order. We need a motion, he said, clearing his throat. We must vote on disabling the gate until we're in full compliance. This is urgent. Carver's face twisted in frustration. Disabling the gate? That undermines everything we worked for. We'll lose property value, not to mention the security we promised. A heavy silence settled. Then Ms. Parker, a woman in her 70s, stood. I've lived in Willow Bend for 25 years. It's always been a friendly, safe place. Now we've gained an expensive gate and lost our peace of mind. I'm seconding the motion to disable it. A ripple of approval passed through the crowd. People raised their hands to vote. Carver tried to cut in, but each time he attempted to speak, voices overrode him. They'd had enough. With an overwhelming majority, the HOA voted to disable the gate immediately. In that instant, Carver's authority felt like it dissolved before our eyes. An electrician in the neighborhood offered to help shut off the gate's power for good, at least until proper emergency measures were installed. Mr. Fellows promised to collaborate with the fire department and building authority, ensuring full compliance. Residents demanded complete transparency. No more hush-hush decisions or ambiguous emails. After the vote, the tension in the room eased. Some folks hugged. Others murmured about relief that no more lives would be risked. The sense of community I'd craved upon moving and finally resurfaced, anchored by a new unity formed in crisis. Carver, meanwhile, stormed out. Days later, we heard he'd resigned from the HOA board altogether, citing unnecessary hostility. Rumor had it he was looking to sell his house. I wasn't sure if he was leaving because of the fine or because he'd lost the respect of so many neighbors, or both. In the weeks that followed, compliance repairs moved rapidly. Aunt Gwen's department maintained pressure, and the building authority insisted the HOA install a standard lockbox and universal passcode that would grant immediate entry to firefighters, police, and paramedics. The once vaunted software was stripped down to something simpler and more foolproof, with manual overrides to ensure no future fiascos. The cost was steep, but not as staggering as a $500,000 fine. After seeing real progress, the fire department reduced the total penalty to something more manageable, but it was still in the hundreds of thousands, distributed across multiple violations. The final blow: the HOA's insurance provider raised the neighborhood's liability premiums, citing risk due to delayed emergency response potential. A few outraged residents threatened lawsuits against Carver personally, but it seemed he vanished before those threats materialized. Meanwhile, Mr. Fellows stepped in as interim HOA president, coordinating with the rest of the board to ensure there was no repeat of the gate crisis. When the final wave of news coverage subsided, Willow Bend slowly returned to a calmer pace of life. One breezy Saturday morning, I was out front trimming my hedges when Aunt Gwen pulled up in her SUV. She hopped out with a friendly wave. "Just checking in," she called. I smiled, happy to say the gate's open and the code box is working. They installed the official lockbox this week. She nodded. I saw the update on my desk. "Glad it's all sorted." For a moment, she glanced around the neighborhood with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I never meant to upend things here. But these regulations exist for a reason. What happened to Mrs. Vogel could have been much worse." "I know," I said, "and you did the right thing. I'm proud you're my aunt, fire chief or not." She patted my shoulder affectionately. "Anyway, I'm headed to a meeting." "Looks like my work is never done," she joked, rolling her eyes. Then she climbed back into her SUV. I watched her drive away, reflecting on how a single gate could throw an entire community into upheaval, but also how it united us to push back against poor leadership and do what was best for everyone. A few neighbors walked by, greeting me with smiles, people who, not so long ago, might have just waved politely from a distance. Now, we shared a bond, having come through a crisis that tested our collective spirit. That evening, I visited Mrs. Vogel, who was out on her porch crocheting. Her granddaughter offered me lemonade. "I'm so glad that's all behind us," Mrs. Vogel said with a weary but warm smile. "Me too," I replied, taking a seat beside her. "I'd rather not risk another locked gate moment." She chuckled softly. "We sure gave the news something to talk about, didn't we?" Her granddaughter nodded. "And it's nice to see everyone stepping up to help now. So many people brought meals when Grandma came home." I gazed down the street, remembering how different things felt just a short while ago, how that massive gate loomed as a symbol of separation and near tragedy. Now, it stood open, ready to welcome first responders with no hesitation. A lesson in humility for the HOA, and a renewed sense of fellowship among us residents. Eventually, the swirl of controversies, fines, and board politics faded into memory, but the story of how Willow Bend nearly sacrificed human safety for the sake of exclusivity remained a cautionary tale. And it was one that made us all just a little bit wiser, a little bit kinder. Whenever I spot Aunt Gwen at a county event, I can't help smiling. She never flaunted her power. She simply did her duty, and in doing so, she reminded everyone, myself included, that a locked gate can't stand between a determined fire chief and the community she's pledged to protect. The end.